The first phone call from the bank was confusing. It was an automated message about some overdraft fees. I'm a 51-year-old accountant for a small firm. I never overdraw my account. It just doesn't happen. My life is built on precision, on numbers that always add up. My wife and I, we live a quiet life in our split-level suburban house. Our kids are grown and out of the house. Our biggest problem is deciding which restaurant to try on a Friday night. I figured it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a phishing scam or something. I've heard of those. I told my wife about it that night while we watched television. She just shook her head and said I was overthinking things. She always said that. David, my brother, came over on Sunday to help me fix the fence. He's always been the family handyman. He showed up with his usual smile and a toolbox full of tools. We spent the afternoon working in the backyard, talking about our kids and the old neighborhood. We grew up together, and he knew everything about me. I trusted him with my life. He was my best friend. The next day, I got another call. This time, it was an alert about a credit card application. It was in my name, and it was approved. A platinum card with a huge credit limit. It was a card I would never apply for. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. My world looked exactly the same, but the ground was starting to shift. I stood in my office, staring at the paperwork on my desk. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but the silence in the house, it felt heavier somehow. It felt different now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I kept thinking about David. I kept thinking about his smile. I tried to go back to my life, to pretend that nothing had happened. I went to work at the firm, crunching numbers just like I always did. The credit card alert felt like a bad dream. Maybe it was some kind of computer error, a glitch in the system. My wife kept telling me to forget about it, that everything was fine. We still had our quiet dinners and watched our shows at night, but I couldn't forget. I started noticing things that I'd never noticed before, the way David would always want to come over and use my laptop. He'd say his was slow and he needed to check something fast. I always let him. I never thought twice about it. He knew my passwords. He knew all my personal information. We had been brothers forever. He was always in some sort of financial trouble. He would ask me for small loans here and there. He always paid me back, but it was always tight for him. He was a good guy, just a little reckless with his money. That's what I told myself. Now, looking back, those were the warning signs, the little hints that something wasn't right. I went to my bank. I talked to a teller who looked at my account. She said she couldn't see any issue. I asked her to check the other credit cards, the ones I actually owned. Everything seemed to be in order. I felt a little better, but the feeling of dread stayed with me. It felt like a small, sharp stone in my shoe. I just wanted to go back to normal. I can't tell you exactly when the feeling turned from a vague unease into a full-blown sickness. I'd been trying to ignore the bank alerts, to write them off as a fluke. I told my wife they were nothing, a mistake by the bank. She seemed to believe me. David kept coming over just like normal. We'd talk and watch a game on television. He'd still ask for money sometimes, $100 here or there. I would give it to him. He was family. He was my brother. Then the mail started coming. I got a notice from some obscure credit company. It was a letter demanding payment for a delinquent account. The name on the account was mine, but the address was one I didn't recognize. It was a P.O. box in a city 2 hours away. The purchases listed were things I would never buy: a brand new gaming console, a high-end laptop, expensive clothes I'd never wear. My heart started to pound in my chest. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. I looked at the letter and then at the phone, my hand hovering over the receiver. I didn't know who to call. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want to accuse anyone. Not yet. I just wanted to understand. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter shaking in my hand. My wife came in and asked what was wrong. I just told her it was a work thing, a new problem with a client. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I couldn't say I thought someone was using my identity. I kept thinking about David. He was the only one who could have done this. He had the information, the access. My mind reeled. The man who had been a constant in my life, my confidant, my brother. I started to doubt everything. The quiet talks we'd had, the long Sunday afternoons spent watching football, the trust I had placed in him. It was all a lie. I felt a cold kind of anger start to grow inside me. It wasn't a hot, furious anger. It was a quiet, deep-seated rage. I looked out the window at the fence he had helped me fix. He had seemed so normal, so helpful, a perfect brother, but the world I had built for myself was starting to crack. The cracks were getting bigger, more obvious, and the man I thought I knew, I realized I didn't know him at all. I felt a cold dread settle over me. I wanted to believe it wasn't David. I needed it not to be him. I went to the post office and rented a box of my own. I wanted to see if more mail would come to the fake address. It felt like I was playing some kind of twisted game. The whole thing felt unreal. I called David. I said something vague about a mix-up with my mail. I asked him if he had been getting anything strange. He was so calm on the phone. He said he hadn't, and he sounded genuinely concerned for me. He suggested that I call the credit companies myself. I felt this surge of guilt for even suspecting him. How could I have been so wrong about my own brother? He was my family after all. He was the good son. He was the one who always showed up. My parents had always said that. My wife told me to just drop it. She said I was inventing problems. She said I was paranoid. The silence was the worst part. She wouldn't even discuss it. It was like I was a stranger speaking a foreign language. I started to question my own sanity. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just stressed out from work. Maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing. But the mail kept coming. The letters were piling up now. New credit cards, new loan applications, all in my name, all going to that P.O. box. I would sit on the couch at night holding one of the envelopes, and I could feel my world getting smaller. My wife would pretend not to notice. She would just turn up the volume on the television. I felt so alone. I kept trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he needed money for a medical procedure. Maybe he was in debt to some dangerous people. Maybe he had a good reason. But I knew in my gut there was no good reason for this kind of betrayal. I felt the weight of misplaced guilt. I was blaming myself for not seeing it sooner. I was blaming myself for trusting him too much. I was caught in a cycle of denial. I couldn't face the truth. Not yet. The evidence started to pile up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't just the letters now. I went to my bank in person, and this time I was firm. I spoke to a branch manager and explained everything. I told her about the calls, the credit cards, the mail, and the P.O. box. I told her I suspected my identity had been compromised. She pulled up a report and the color drained from her face. There were multiple lines of credit open in my name. The total debt was staggering. The loans were all small at first. Then they got bigger and bigger. They were all linked to that P.O. box. She looked at me with a mix of pity and concern. I asked her to print out everything. The stack of papers was thick. It was a complete financial history of a person who wasn't me. It was the history of a reckless, desperate man, a man who was living off my name, my good credit. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I went home and spread the papers out on the dining room table. My wife came in and saw them. She didn't say anything, but her face was pale. She just walked away. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't want to know. It was as if she was already isolating herself from the truth. I felt the truth in my gut, a sick, heavy feeling. It was David. It had to be him. I had told him my social security number once a long time ago. I had helped him fill out a form for a loan he was trying to get. I hadn't thought about it since. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a joke. It was a deliberate long-term act of betrayal. My hands were shaking as I sorted through the papers. I saw his face in my mind, his easy smile. I felt like a fool. I hadn't acted yet. I hadn't confronted him. But the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about my credit score. It was about my entire life. I drove over to my parents' house. David was there. He was sitting on the back deck, drinking a beer, laughing with my dad. Everything seemed so normal. The kind of normal that felt like a punch to the gut. I walked up to him, the stack of papers in a manila envelope clutched in my hand. He saw me and his smile vanished. He knew. I didn't have to say a word. The look on his face said it all. My dad saw the tension and asked what was wrong. I just told him it was something between me and David. My mom came out and told me not to cause a scene. I told her I couldn't help it. My voice was low and it was shaking. I slid the envelope across the table. David didn't touch it. He just stared at it. I started talking. I talked about the bank alerts, the credit card applications, the P.O. box, and the letters. I talked about the sheer amount of debt. I talked about how he had used my social security number, how he had used my life. David just sat there. He didn't deny it. He just sat there in silence. My parents were shocked. They looked at him, then at me, then back at him. My dad asked him if it was true. David just took a long, slow sip of his beer. He looked at me, and his eyes were cold. Not regretful, just cold. He said he needed the money. He said he had no other choice. My dad started to yell. My mom started to cry. But I just stood there. I felt a strange kind of calm. It was the calm that comes after the storm. I had known the truth, but now it was out in the open. The quiet confrontation, the shocking admission. It was the moment I stopped hoping for a lie and started facing the reality. I looked at my brother and I saw a stranger. I looked at my parents and I saw two people who were heartbroken. I looked at myself in the reflection on the glass door. I looked like a man who had just lost everything. The man I knew was gone. The man I trusted was a ghost. The drive home was quiet. My wife didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The truth was finally out. I could feel her silence like a physical weight in the car. When we got home, she went into the bedroom and shut the door. I sat in the living room. The silence was deafening. I called my parents later that night. My mom answered. She was crying. She said David was devastated. She said he was sorry. I didn't believe her. I didn't believe him. My dad got on the phone. He was angry, but not at David. He was angry at me. He said I was overreacting. He said I was trying to ruin my brother's life. He said family was everything. He said I should just forgive him and work it out. I just listened to him. I didn't try to defend myself. There was no point. My parents had already chosen a side. It wasn't mine. David had always been their favorite. He was the one who needed more help. He was the one they felt sorry for. I was the responsible one, the one who had his life together. They never worried about me. They always just expected me to be fine. The world I had known, the world where my family was a safe place, it had shifted completely. My wife's quiet disappointment, my parents' shocking indifference, it all felt like a new kind of isolation. My world had irrevocably changed. The comfortable life I had built, it was all built on a foundation of lies. The walls were still up, but they were paper thin. I felt like I was living in a house of cards. I looked at the man in the mirror. He was 51 years old. His hair was graying. His eyes were tired. He looked like a stranger. The man who had a perfect life was gone. He was replaced by this weary man who felt betrayed by everyone he loved. I felt an emptiness in my chest. There was no comfort to be found anywhere. I stopped looking for understanding. There was none to be found. The conversation with my parents had made that brutally clear. My wife was still a ghost in our own house. I started looking for a lawyer. I called a few friends in the industry. I found a good one, a woman who specialized in financial fraud. She was tough and didn't waste my time. I gave her all the papers, the bank records, the credit card statements. She looked through them and just shook her head. She said it was one of the clearest cases she had ever seen. The evidence was all there. I stopped thinking about what David had done to me emotionally. I started thinking about it as a series of cold, hard transactions. He had taken something from me, and I was going to take it back. This wasn't about being the bigger person. This wasn't about family. This was about justice, a cold, hard kind of justice. I went to the post office and closed the P.O. box he had been using. I changed all my online passwords. I got new credit cards and closed the old ones. I put a freeze on my credit. I was taking my life back, piece by piece. My wife saw the change in me. I was no longer a man lost in confusion. I was a man on a mission. She didn't ask about it. She just watched me. I didn't tell her what I was doing. I didn't want her to try and stop me. The first thing my lawyer did was send a certified letter to David. It was a formal demand for payment of the full amount of debt he had accrued in my name. I knew he wouldn't pay it. I knew he couldn't. It was just the first move in the game. He had chosen to play a cold game. I was going to play colder. My lawyer filed the lawsuit. It was for fraud, identity theft, and financial damages. I knew it would hit David hard. There was no going back now. My wife found the papers, the court documents. She looked at them and her face was blank. She didn't scream or cry. She just looked at me with this empty expression. She said I was destroying our family. She said I was destroying him. I just told her that he had already destroyed it. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a protagonist in my own story. This wasn't a confession. This was a battle. I went to a police station and filed a report. The officer took my statement. He said these cases were becoming more and more common. He looked at me with no emotion. It was just a job for him. He wrote everything down. I saw David at the grocery store a few days later. He looked at me and his face hardened. He didn't speak. He just stared at me with pure hatred. I didn't flinch. I just stared back. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He had moved on from guilt. He was just angry that he had been caught. He thought he could get away with it. I could see the rage in his eyes. He saw me not as a brother, but as an enemy. And I felt the same way. The quiet, deep-seated rage inside me was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about winning. The court date was set. The tension was at its peak. The lawyers were emailing back and forth. The police report was filed. David knew I was coming for him, and I was. The days felt long and tense. My wife and I lived in a strained silence. Our home was no longer a place of comfort. It was a place of war. I was in too deep. I had to see it through to the end. The trial date arrived. The courtroom was small and packed. My parents were there. David was there with his own lawyer, a cheap-looking guy who seemed out of his depth. My wife was there, sitting in the back row, not looking at me. She was looking at David. The court proceedings were cold and clinical. My lawyer presented her case. She laid out the papers, the bank records, the credit reports, the police report. It was an avalanche of evidence. It was all there in black and white. David's lawyer tried to argue that it was a simple misunderstanding. He tried to argue that my brother was mentally unstable and needed help. He said I was being too hard on him. He said I should drop the charges. I just sat there. I looked at David. He looked small and broken. He looked like a cornered animal. My parents were crying silently. I felt nothing. No pity, no remorse, just emptiness. The judge didn't take long. He looked at the evidence. He looked at David. He said the case was clear. He found David guilty of financial fraud and identity theft. The restitution was ordered, but I knew he would never pay it. A prison sentence was also handed down. The judge said the severity of the crime warranted a serious punishment. David's face went white. He just stared at the judge. My mom let out a sob. My dad put his head in his hands. It was over. The verdict was the final blow. It wasn't about healing or peace. It was simply an end. An end to the life I had known. An end to my relationship with my brother. An end to my old family. The courtroom emptied out. My wife walked past me without a word, following my parents out the door. She didn't look back. I just stood there for a long time. I was alone. The silence felt different now. It was no longer a strained, tense silence. It was the silence of a void. It was an absence of sound, an absence of family. I walked out into the cold air. The world looked exactly the same. The cars were driving by. People were going to work, but my world was completely gone. I got in my car and drove home. The house was empty. My wife had taken some of her things. Her side of the closet was bare. The house felt like a tomb. I walked around, touching the furniture, looking at the pictures on the wall, pictures of a family that didn't exist anymore, pictures of me and David when we were kids. He was smiling in all of them. I just stood there staring at those old pictures. There was no closure. There was no peace. It wasn't about feeling better. It was just what was left. Silence, distance, maybe a new kind of emptiness. I sat on the couch in the living room. The television was off. I just sat there in the dark. The house was quiet. My life was quiet. I won the battle, but I lost the war. It was a cold, brutal truth. I just sat there in the silence. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.